Good morning. I'm so excited to talk to you all today about compelling conversations for fundraisers. Our book club selection for February. Can't believe we're already here at the end of February. It feels like it just flew by. January felt like it was 3 or 4 months long. And then I look up, I'm like, wow, we're getting closer to March. So I am excited, as I said, to talk to you today and look forward to seeing your comments and your feedback on this month's selection. It was an interesting read for me. I usually like to start off by talking about things that I liked about the book, start on a positive note. So this book, I really liked how it was written and broken down by donor type. I felt like that was very handy for people who are working in fundraising who want to use this as sort of a guide moving forward. That, if you read through the whole book now, and then let's say you maybe don't have anybody who's in your planned giving prospects, and then all of a sudden that changes, and it maybe next year or the year after, and you're like, wait, what did that book say? I think it would be really easy to reference that section based on how they've broken this down. I also thought it was a really easy read. It was a quick read. I'll be honest, this month I got a little behind again because it flew by on me. My family took a vacation, and I didn't bring the book with me. So I read this in the last few days, and it was a quick read. It's about 100 pages, big print, and I all of a sudden looked up and it was done. I liked the script-like sections too. I felt like that would be something that could easily be utilized in your office setting, where you maybe have a teammate that could come in and do some role playing with you and help you get comfortable with having those conversations and using that exact word. Obviously, you don't want to memorize it and sound like you're in a play, but you could get comfortable with saying the things that were in these scripts so that you could utilize them in meetings with people. I thought the references or the resources section in the back was incredibly helpful. There's a lot of things that, even as almost now crazy 20-year veteran in the nonprofit fundraising field, I think I'm going to be able to utilize some of the things in the back there. Really liked the links that they referenced, and the more in-depth contact reports. I thought those would have been really helpful in my career when I was interfacing more often with individual donors, but also something that I can utilize when I'm talking to grant administrators or program directors for our clients now. So I'm very grateful for those resources as part of this book. Some of the things that I thought were a little bit challenging in reading this was it felt a little bit repetitive at times. And I think that's just based on the fact that they did break it down by donor type, and there was some strategies that they suggested for one donor type that can be utilized for other donor types as well. And they did reinforce some of the same concepts over and over again. So that was helpful. Probably not a bad thing to do that. It read a bit like an instruction manual, which was not what I expected when I read the reviews and read the summary. But once I got into that and got used to that kind of flow, they weren't telling a story like some of our other book club selections have done. They did utilize some like real world scenarios that were a bit more narrative like, but it did read a little instruction manually to me. And having been in fundraising for a really long time, it felt a little 101 in some sections, but I think if you're new to fundraising, that this would be incredibly helpful for you, and a good refresher if you're like me and a little bit more senior in your experience with fundraising. So let's jump right in. Chapter 1 is called Values and Case Statement. Fundraisers need to know more than just your mission statement was really the summary of this whole chapter, and it reinforced that gone are the days when you're just going to memorize your elevator pitch and that's going to be enough to inspire somebody to give to you. Telling your organization's values is a really effective way of doing that, of connecting with people on a personal level. And I really liked how the book gave some exercises on how to determine what those values are and some value suggestions, because it can feel, when you're thinking in those terms, it can feel a little bit ambiguous and a little bit pie in the sky. Like, is this realistic? But when you break it down and you think about, what's your purpose? Why? Not just they talk about that a little further on, but not just what you do, why do you do it? This sentence on page 7 struck me. It says most people don't care about how you go about what you do. They only care about what it means and how it changes lives. I mean, that's the root of your values. And it's really important in grant writing too, for me, doing grant writing on a daily basis. We don't often get to connect with human beings. Nowadays it seems that more applications are just submit the form online, hit the submit button and wait. So your application can get lost in the noise if all you're doing is talking about the functionality of your organization. So it's important for us to use those values to differentiate ourselves from the rest of that noise, the rest of the organizations that are just kind of saying, again, instruction manual, here's what we do, here's how we do it. We utilize values to relay that same message. We can differentiate that nonprofit from other organizations doing very similar or the same work. The authors reinforce the importance of listening to donors and your prospects. And I thought that was a really great sort of reminder or throwback to last month's book, that we talked about, the Mr. Rogers effect, and how Mr. Rogers, the author in the Mr. Rogers effect, and Mr. Rogers himself talked about authentic listening. And I think if you utilize some of those same practices from the Mr. Rogers effect with the scripts in this book, you could be really effective. And that's sheer coincidence. When I was reading them, I was like, oh, that was timed really well. Understanding the importance of the pivot. They talk about the pivot a lot in this chapter and how that's really your role in any conversation with a donor, is to build that relationship and listen and really authentically listen and have a true conversation with them. But know that it's your responsibility to pivot that conversation towards fundraising, and how that can be a learning curve for new nonprofit fundraising professionals. And that you can't let the conversation get too far away from the mission of the conversation, which is to talk about a gift at some point. And that, you have to be very straightforward. It's critical to be candid about why you're meeting with that person. You never want to surprise a donor when you're sitting across the table from them that, oh, this conversation is about a donation. You don't want to surprise them with that. The key takeaway for me in this chapter was understanding your responsibilities in any conversation with a donor or a prospect. Chapter 2 moved into acquiring new donors. And that's, for me, it's always been the hardest part of fundraising, and is to get those new donors. And the authors share that one way to make that a little bit easier is to understand your why. And this ties back to those values in chapter 1. You're not just listing off a litany of your services, and you're connecting with humans, other humans, to make a positive impact on the humans that you serve, really digging down into that, what inspires people to give. It's not going to be a list of services. It's going to be that positive impact that you can have on people. And I think this is a steering away from what has traditionally in the past been the approach to the typical fundraising mantra of gloom and doom, right? If we don't have your money, all these terrible things are going to happen. And we've talked about this before, where that is just, even scientifically, psychologically, that is not inspiring to anybody, and it may have worked in the past because people maybe didn't know better, or they thought differently. But in recent years, it's been determined that it's been much more successful for nonprofits to present the positive aspects that will occur with philanthropy, to say these people's lives will change for the better. The only thing that's missing is your money, is much more effective than to say these awful things are going to continue to happen to these people if we don't have your money. You're saying the same thing. You're just presenting it in a positive way that's more inspiring. Think about how you want to get involved. I want to get involved because of those values and the positive aspect of what you do, not, I'm going to throw a couple dollars in a bucket and hopefully that makes a difference for these people. I don't really see how it's going to, because you presented that it's just so awful. So how's my $100 going to make a difference? It's all about thinking about how the donor kind of consumes what you're putting out there. And if it's something that comes across in a negative light, you're probably going to get a negative reaction. That's my little tangent there. But I talk to our nonprofit clients about that all the time. It is sort of the instinct to say, gosh, this is just miserable and terrible, and you need to help us fix it. But realistically, and particularly in grant writing, we just see a much more positive response to that positive approach to helping us make life better. I really like the list of questions on page 25. Those are really helpful of how to think about the why for your organization. They'd be really helpful in drafting content for a grant application too. We always include a why section in our grant narratives when we're able to do that. And that shows the value of investing very specifically in this organization and not other ones that are doing similar work. Excuse me. The author shared that every conversation should have a call to action, and that's really basic fundraising principles right there. The donor or the prospect should be able to anticipate that you're going to ask them or what's going to be presented to them at that meeting. And this can feel a little icky at first, right? When you're first learning how to do this, when you're on the phone with somebody or you're sending them an email and you're like, hey, can we meet for coffee so I can talk to you about making a donation? But with practice and understanding of everybody's interests, the donor's interests and their values, it gets easier over time and it becomes kind of second nature. And you feel like you're being wise about your time. The authors talk about this too. Like, you want to be straightforward, because if that person's going to say to you, no, I'm never going to give you a gift, like I'll meet you for coffee, but I'm never giving you money, then you're going to approach that differently, right? You may go into it socially and think, yeah, I'll meet him for coffee and we're just not going to talk about it because he straight up told me he's never going to give me a gift. And then you know that you're not going to be spinning your wheels in the future, to have that candid and really honest, open communication. The key takeaway for me in chapter 2 was there's a line in the wrap-up section that really struck me on page 35. The authors say, because what you do is important, it is critical that you understand how to qualify prospects and turn them into donors. The former is not about running a wealth screening and seeing if this person is wealthy. It's about having conversations to find out if his or her values and dreams can find a match within your organization. Hey, Teresa, I've been talking and going through the book, and I'm glad to have you join me. You're welcome to stay on mute if you just like to listen, but I'd love to have your insight too if you'd like to contribute anything. I'm talking about my key takeaway right now for chapter 2, which is about acquiring new donors. And just went through a quote there in the wrap up that was really interesting to me about how it's not all about wealth and wealth screening when you're looking at new donors. I worked for an organization that spent entirely too much time and too many resources on wealth screenings and all those tools, and they put way too much stock in it. And I am sure that we missed many opportunities to connect with people who could have provided us with transformational philanthropy just because they didn't own a boat or they didn't live in the right zip code. And I think so many people just don't qualify on these wealth screenings. And, so many people that you see the same people over and over again, right? So if I'm using the same wealth screening that a nonprofit's using that's down the road from me, they're probably contacting the same people, and those people are tapped out. It might not matter that they're, multimillionaires. They maybe have nothing left to give for nonprofit fundraising. But, if you look at people beyond just where they fall in your wealth screenings, and have quality conversations with them, and particularly existing donors and particularly the recurring donors. I'm going to share a story about a recurring donor too, but, they may be really good prospects to move through the fundraising cycle for you. So moving on to chapter 3, it's about renewing donors. One line that struck me was on page 38. It was, speaking with donors about the difference they have made is critical if you want to keep them as donors. And I think about the nonprofits that I've supported in my lifetime as Melanie Lambert, and not Just Right Grants working for them, but Melanie Lambert giving money. And I can count, sadly, probably on one hand, the ones that sent me follow-up. And even if it's just a standardized report, I have one nonprofit that sends me a quarterly program report, but I usually don't hear from them again. And that's just really hard. And they talk about that in the book. So much harder to come back to that donor 3 or 4 or 5 years later and say, hey, where have you been? When they can say the same thing to you, hey, where have you been? I gave you money and then never heard anything from you. And the next conversation after all that time should not be, hey, where have you been? We need your money again. Because then it just feels transactional. It's not a relationship at that point. We used to host a thankathon at a college that I worked for years ago, and it was wildly successful. And although we never approached it and we never asked donors for money on those calls, we always got money. We always had people that made donations as a result of that thankathon, and it was a beautiful, wonderful thing. It was absolutely not the reason why we hosted it. We did it out of pure stewardship, but it was an unintended bonus. And people were always floored that they were just getting a call to say thank you. Like they were always like waiting on the line for the ask. And, even people that didn't answer the phone, we would leave a voicemail. And what was really crazy is like we would say the whole thing we wanted to say to them on their voicemail, and then they would call us back. like they would see that it was the college and they were probably sitting, in their living room and thinking, oh gosh, this is such and such college. And they're probably just calling me to ask for money. And we'd leave the voicemail and they'd call us back and want to chat, and they'd want to know what was going on at the school, or they'd want to know, were you really just calling me to tell me thank you? And it was really fun and it felt good. And our board members loved it. We had existing students that would call and say thank you, usually scholarship recipients. And they loved it. Once they got over that initial kind of, shyness about it, they loved it too, because it was just, everybody was happy. Everybody loves to hear thank you. So a line that struck me thinking about that thankathon was on page 43. It said, the more they feel that your organization adds real value to their lives, the more compelled your donors will be to support the work you do. And I think our thankathon was really proof of that. The key takeaway for me, I noticed the questions on page 46, that the language is primarily you language. So what first drew you to us? Of the things you do know about us, what most excites you when you're speaking to the donor, using you language and not we do this and we need that, but the you? How do you get involved in what we're doing? What can we do to help you feel confident that your generosity is doing what you want it to do? It's not about the organization. It's about the donor and their philanthropic goals. And we've talked about this before too, where, when you have that level of relationship with a donor, that relationship doesn't feel like that power struggle that traditional fundraising and our culture really has taught us that this relationship should be, right? When you start in fundraising, you feel like, gosh, I have a problem. I need money. This person has the money. This person can solve the problem for me, but I have to kind of go groveling to him or her and beg them for money. When reality is that the person that has the money and wants to be philanthropic, they have a problem too, right? They want to give that money away, and they need to decide who they're giving it to. And in some cases, they have to give the money away. Private foundations have to give the money away. So the problem there is finding who to give it to. And so when you come together and think we can both mutually solve each other's problems, then that eliminates that hierarchy that it can feel like such as like impending doom in fundraising. And if you think about it that way, as a level playing field of, I have a problem that this person can solve and this person has a problem that I can solve, then you're both at the same place and you can really have a relationship that is fruitful in the way that philanthropic fundraising should be. That's another soapbox of mine. And I can go on and on and on about that. But I really think that we have to move into that mindset in fundraising. And when we do, we will see a transformational difference in how we approach philanthropy. So chapter 4 is about re-engaging donors. And I liked the refresh. It's been a while since I talked about LIBUNTs and SIBUNTs. And if you're new to fundraising, it's important to know what those are. LIBUNTs is an acronym that stands for last year, but unfortunately not this year. SIBUNTs are some year, but unfortunately not this year. So those are donors that you haven't heard from in a while, and a way to differentiate between how long it's been. Obviously, your Libunts that gave to you last year, but not this year, are going to be your first, lowest hanging fruit, and Sibunts are going to be the next tier, and you're going to approach those individuals in a different way. This chapter talks about that. One stat that was kind of gut-wrenching to me, only 25% of new donors ever make a second gift to an organization. And there can be a lot of factors there. I was trying to think like, well, why? Is it that we don't steward them well? Is it that we're so focused on the mechanisms of fundraising that we're not building those human relationships? Is it that there's so much competition that we have so many different nonprofits in our face all the time and so many different places to support, or that we as humans have a lot of different things that we want to be philanthropic and charitable for, that, we support the Humane Society here, we support the food pantry there, that we kind of spread ourselves out. And sure, there's a lot of reasons for it. But there are some things that we as professional fundraisers can control to increase that number. And this chapter talks about one where the authors say this very positive note that although 25% of new donors, only 25% make a second gift. So that 75% of all new donors never come back a second time. 7 out of 10 lapsed donors, which are those Libunts and Sibunts we just talked about, will re-up with your organization if approached in a way that resonates with them. So 70%, so we can get back a huge chunk of these donors if we manage this right. That's great news. You just have to do your homework and understand how to re-engage them. And I loved this idea on page 51. It says, make sure your reply device, whether it's a card, an email, an online survey, or your website's donation page for each appeal, has a place where lapsed donors can tell you what inspires them about your organization and what it would take for them to re-engage. And so I think that would be important to include in a way that they don't necessarily have to make a gift. Like just getting that feedback from them is a gift, because then that tells you how you can get them as part of those 7 out of 10 that will come back. They're specifically telling you, I would re-engage if somebody called me and told me thank you. I would re-engage if I got a quarterly newsletter, or I would re-engage if whatever they happen to say. And then you know exactly what to do to get them kind of back into the fold. And the book does a great job with some scripts of how to do that, because that can be tricky to navigate as well. And I particularly appreciated the scripts for those uncomfortable conversations where the donor is possibly angry. I remember working for the Phonathon at my alma mater when I was in college, and, just this little naive 19 or 20-year-old, and, I enjoyed it and did good. And it kind of, I think set the precedent for a career in fundraising for me that I didn't know was going to be a thing. Nobody grows up saying, I want to be a nonprofit fundraising professional when I grow up. But I memorized my little script and I had it all prepared, and then I'd gone through a few scenarios with the fundraising staff there at the school. And I had a very frustrated alumni on the end of the call one night who was not happy with the new college president. And as a teenager, young adult, I didn't really know how to manage that at all, and got very flustered and did not solve his, his concern, didn't know how to answer his concerns. But it kind of set a tone for me, and I was always nervous about those conversations. And I think the scripts in this book would have been very helpful for me to have those conversations with people and know kind of instinctually how to approach those, because they will happen. Hopefully it's few and far between, but it's just the nature of the work that we do that we can't make everybody happy all the time. We can certainly try, but there's going to be people that have things that are the reason why they don't give anymore that are just beyond our control. I liked how the author said, don't apologize until you have a real good reason to apologize. Me saying, so I'm sorry you don't like our new president, I probably said that, but it didn't change anything for him, and it didn't make him a donor again. So I really liked how they talk about too, like, be on the same side with that donor. Don't argue with them. That gets you nowhere. And how they really, again, emphasize that authentic listening. That's a really great cross-reference, can't say that word today, to our book last month with the Mr. Rogers Effect. Key takeaway in chapter 4 for me was that donor attrition is a natural part of fundraising. It's going to happen no matter what we do. But if we focus on truly engaging our donors, it's just much easier to understand what motivated them to give in the first place, and things that we can do to prevent additional attrition and positive ways to reengage those people. Chapter 5 was about upgrading donors, and this chapter felt a little bit repetitious to me, but again, I understand how it's important to talk about donors and how to move them through the donor pyramid. But the key takeaway there was, for me, the last section of the chapter where they talk about, it says, quote, deepening a relationship relies on learning more about each other. Too often, fundraisers get hung up on pitching a need to a donor. Resist that. Learn how to turn your pitch into a conversation, listen carefully, and turn that no into a yes, or at least one that's like a response that says, sure, I'll listen. Chapter 6 was about planned gifts, endowments, and bequests. Big difference there. These are gift types that oftentimes fundraising professionals get a little bit of heartburn about because they can be pretty complicated and awkward. One of the things that I always kind of shied away from too, like, who wants to talk about what happens to their money after they die? But I really liked how the authors emphasized how planned gifts are about the donor's values and how that links back to what they talked about in chapter 1. The authors mentioned that most bequests are not made by your major donors, but rather those that are just really committed to the organization. And one nonprofit that I worked for years ago, we had a donor that gave us $25 a month, recurring donation. She wrote a check, she sent it in the mail. She never wanted to talk about her giving. She didn't want any sort of stewardship. She liked having her receipts, and that was really all she needed. If we tried to call her, she was not receptive to that. We tried really hard. She passed away, and we learned that we were part of her estate plans. And although she had given us no more than $300 a year for years, which added up, every dollar counts, we had no idea that she had the capacity to give at the level that she included us in her will. It was certainly a legacy gift, and that legacy, I'm sure, is still continuing today. So that's just a key takeaway there for me. From my experience, I always put a lot of value and stock into those recurring donations, that even the ones that may feel like, in the end of the day, it might feel like a drop in the bucket, but you don't know what that person, you may not know what that person has planned. But one of the things that the authors talk about is having those conversations with donors so that you can know, and so that they can feel like their values will continue on beyond their lifetime. That's the key takeaway for me, and that they emphasize that it is not our job to know every detail about charitable remainder trusts and last wills and testaments and real estate and gifts of stuff, all that stuff. We don't have to know all the details about that as fundraising professionals, and we shouldn't. Our job is to start the conversation and then connect that donor with the people who are the experts on those giving mechanisms, and so that they can build those in a way that meets their personal goals and their financial goals. And for me, I think the questions on page 76 were extremely helpful when thinking about these conversations. Chapter 7, the integrated ask. I think this chapter is important because if you're new to fundraising conversations with donors, it can be really hard to do the thanks but no thanks pushback. If they present a gift like they talked about in the book, where they're in a capital campaign, they've got these donors that give to them annually, and they give a $5,000 gift, and the donors come back and say, yeah, sure, you can use our $5,000 gift towards the capital campaign. Well, if you think about that, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? You're making your job harder because you've got to have that $5,000 a year to run your organization. If you're in a capital campaign, you want your donors to give above and beyond what they're already giving for the annual campaign, or you're backtracking. So it's hard to have that conversation. And in the book, they do it seamlessly. And I know in the book, they're writing script for pretend characters, but they do provide some really great insight on how to do that and to present it to the donor, of not just, oh no, that doesn't work. Like, no, that's not what I asked you. or like to come back and say, oh yes, of course, yes, that's what I'll do. And then you go back to your office and you're like, oh, why did I do that? Why didn't I just tell them? And I think, it's easy to have that, hey, something's better than nothing thought process when you're in fundraising, particularly when you're new. But this statement struck me on page 92. It says, your integrated ask is really an integrated plan where you have considered how you can best engage the donor and help them to meet their philanthropic goals while helping your organization meet its mission. Chapter 8 was obviously my favorite, Foundations and Conversations. I like how the author reinforced what I shout from the rooftops around here, which is calling a program officer or a grant administrator to build a relationship can have so much value. On page 96, they state, most program officers will welcome the opportunity to learn about organizations that match and fulfill their foundation's mission. And if you're new to grant writing, this can feel very scary, and again, if you're thinking about fundraising from that, I have a problem and they're the solution, instead of I have a problem and a solution for their problem. When you think about it that way, then it all kind of, it all matches up, right? That they would want to have a conversation with you. They would want to talk to you about your organization and how you can help them solve their problem of the fact that they have money that they have to give away. So you're both coming together mutually to solve each other's problem. And I reinforce this with our clients all the time at Just Right Grants, how it's important, if the foundation allows it, to build that relationship. Hey, Alan, it's so good to see you. I'm talking about chapter 8.
Chapter 8, I didn't get that far, unfortunately, but I really love the whole scope of the view.
Yeah,
I'm
great.
looking forward to hearing a bit more about the latest chapter.
Yeah, well, this is the last chapter, and it's just kind of been me sharing what my experience was reading the book so far. But I've just got a couple more points, and then I would love to hear, and then I kind of do a wrap up. So I'd love to hear what you think about what you've read so far and anything that's kind of jumped out at you. But right now, just talking about how important it is to build those relationships with foundations. And I think fundraising professionals are either really scared of that or they don't know how to manage it, when in reality, a program officer or a grant administrator is very similar to a major donor, right? I mean, you would want to cultivate them and steward them the same way. And if they allow it, the authors say, things like sending them a copy of your annual report, sending them news that's really relevant. If you know that they're very invested in pediatric healthcare, then it makes sense for you, if something big happens in the world of pediatric healthcare, to send that to them and say, hey, look what I saw. I wanted to share this with you. Or news from your organization, if you bring on a new executive director or you add a new program, to share that with them so that they feel like they're really a partner in what you're doing and not just a transactional checkbook sitting somewhere, waiting to be asked for money. And I think, I really liked this one too. And I think I'm going to put this into use in our work, is when you have that relationship with the program administrator, the grant administrator, and you can say, hey, we submitted our application and I noticed it didn't ask for an executive summary. I'd be happy to put one together for you if that's helpful when you present our proposal to the review committee. And I thought that is gold because if the grant administrator's got 50 or 100 applications to review kind of in that first pass, if I can make that easier for him or her, that probably just skyrockets our likelihood of success. And if nothing else, might make us stick out in the crowd, even if they say, oh, well, I can't really do that, or, whatever the response is that might not be, yes, that'd be helpful. At least it's us kind of doing something a little bit different. Anything that gets us positively doing something different in the grand scheme of things for how competitive grant writing is, to me, just feels like a golden ticket. It's like, I am absolutely going to start implementing that. But the key takeaway for me in this chapter was that foundations are made up of human beings and they've got philanthropic goals just like we do. And I like that the author says, I didn't write down what page this is on, but I think it's in the wrap up for chapter 8. They are more than the receiver of your written proposal, but someone who is also committed to the same issues that you are. And I try to remember that in grant writing because it can get so formulaic and it can get so sort of, I'm just a wheel in the the big process. And when we remember that they are human beings too, then I think, we connect much better and increase our likelihood of success. And that's what it's all about. But Alan, I'd love to hear what you think about it so far. And Teresa, if you're in a place where you can jump in and share what you've thought about the book so far or about the topics we covered today, please feel free.
Yeah, excellent. If you don't mind, I go ahead. So I didn't get as far as you did in the book. I still got some pages to read yet. But what I really liked was it says it's pretty much in the title. It's compelling conversation. It's all about establishing relationships to, as you say, human beings, to people. I mean, yeah, we all have different parts in whatever we do, but in the grand scheme of things, we all still interested in getting our message across and serving the good work we do. Mm-hmm. So I really like the idea that you just have to connect. You have to find a way to connect. And I found it. I think I'm pretty good at connecting, but what was really good for me was this idea of the pivot. Because I can establish a connection, I can make a compelling conversation, but you have to take it down to, okay, but we have to talk about this. These are the fundraising needs that are going to serve our mission. So that was crucial to me because I find it hard sometimes, and I get tangled up in really long conversations like now. I seem to be rambling on for minutes. And it's really, just boiling it down to what is really important. Okay, now I've got to make a pivot. Now we have to talk about our program or our needs and how to better serve the mission we're working for. Yep. And that was another point that I thought that's worth mentioning. It's the mission. It's all about the mission and the why. The mission and the why. So that's as far as I got in the book. But I think those were really strong points from what I read.
Yeah, and I talked about this a little earlier on, but how that's so important in individual donation or individual donors when you're having those conversations face to face, but even in the written form of what we're doing with grant writing, to again differentiate ourselves. There could be 10 other nonprofits doing exactly what you're doing that are applying to the same funder, and if they're going through, here's what our program does, A, B, C, D. Here's where we are, here's what we do, but there's no values in there and there's no why in there. And we always draft that why section and try to use it as often as we can, because to me, that's the differentiating factor. And and not just because we're including it, but because your why, I could have 4 different homeless shelters as clients, and they're all ultimately their mission is the same thing, to end homelessness. So but even though their mission can all be the same, their why can be 4 different reasons. And so that's what we're hoping to connect with people on that level. And I liked how, when she was talking about, I don't know if you've gotten to this conversation yet, but the development officer who was trying to get the author to come speak to the young women who were writing and really connected with her personal experience. Well, their whys were the same. So when the why is the same, then it just kind of happens naturally. And that pivot, I spent years in face-to-face fundraising, and that pivot never gets easier because you kind of feel rude, right? It's like, okay, well, thank you for telling me about your beautiful daughter's wonderful wedding, but now we need to talk money. Like, I'm looking at the watch, like, all right, that's enough. But I think, like it said, like the more you practice it, and I think I probably never did a good job of being as candid as they say in the book you need to be about what the purpose of the meeting would be. I think that
Mm,
I would be afraid to say, hey, we're going to come and talk about our capital campaign, because I would think, oh, they're not going to take this meeting with me. They're going
yeah.
to be like, yeah, there's no way. When I'd be like, oh, can you meet for coffee and we could just catch up? Like, oh yeah, that sounds nice. Let's meet for coffee. And then I've got all that pressure of, this is, in the face to face, the first time that they're going to know that I'm coming here to ask them for money. When if I had done the preliminary work in the email asking for the appointment, to like they say, to say, yes, I want to talk about our capital campaign or this program that we're launching or whatever, so that they know, okay, I'm going into this knowing that this is a fundraising meeting, then they know to anticipate the pivot. And it's less of me being rude and being like, all right, let's wrap this up and let's get down to business.
Yeah, exactly. I really like that too. And I feel it's scary myself. But bottom line, I mean, you're just being honest, you're putting yourself out there, and they can perfectly say no or
Yeah.
say yes. And it saves them time, it saves us time, and it's stress free. If
Yeah.
they say yes, you're in for a good start. If they say no, it's no big deal. I mean, you're going to say no probably anyway. So
Yeah.
it's
And then,
better. Yeah,
like you said, you're not spinning your wheels. You're not like,
exactly.
okay, well, I'm going to go spend an hour and a half in this meeting. I'm going to spend an hour prepping for, all the time you'd invest into it, for them to go, no, I'm never going to give you money. Like, that you would be like, oh, well, why didn't I know that ahead of time? And, I talked about this a little earlier, so it may be a little repetition on the recording, but like thinking about it in a different way than I think our culture, and I don't know if it's the same there as it is in the US, but our culture kind of presents fundraising for nonprofits as this like hierarchy, right? The people that have the money are the people that are in the position of power. And when we look at it from a perspective of, okay, so it's set up to feel like, okay, I have a problem. My problem is I need money for this nonprofit. And this person is the solution because they have the money. But if we look at it that that person also has a problem, or that foundation also has a problem, that they need to give away money or they want to give away money, and we can be the solution to that, then it diminishes that kind of like, this person is up here and I'm down here kind of begging them for money. It makes it more level, right? I can solve their problem, they can solve my problem, and we have a relationship, and we're working towards a common goal through that relationship. And I think if we change that mindset to to more along those lines, then those conversations get less scary. In those cases, it's less of, I'm begging you, I'm coming to you with this need and you have to solve it, when it's really like, how can we come together and it be mutually beneficial here?
Absolutely. I have been reading something else that I haven't finished either. And it's probably it might not be for everybody, but it's about the spirituality behind fundraising. And I'm not taking any sides or but it was very interesting because it said, okay, so this is much larger than you, this is much bigger than you. So it in in my perspective, what it did was kind of release the pressure, because
Yeah.
it's not a personal thing. It's not about me. It's not about me begging. It's not about, it's about the mission. It's about the work we do. It's about the population we serve. And just recently, I also gave a presentation, also asking for money, which one kind of feels vulnerable sometimes because you're asking for money. And I tried to switch this perspective, and it totally made sense, and I felt great about it.
Yeah.
And it was like, you know what, this is okay. I'm asking for this. This is what we really need to do this great work. So rather than asking you, I'm inviting you.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just felt great. It made sense. So yeah, I totally agree.
I'd love to, if you could share a link to that book, I would love to share that and read it myself. I had a friend who's also a consultant, who really promotes a culture of philanthropy, and that's something that he teaches, in the fact that if we do this right, if we build these relationships right and we are passionate about what we are doing from the nonprofit perspective, that passion alone is going to almost be infectious. And so if we're knowledgeable about what we do and what we need, it ultimately will eventually get to a point, if we know our donors well and we time and you know we know the timing and the cycles and all of the things about the donors that we need to know about when we need to have those conversations, eventually you're not going to have to ask, right? That's the ultimate goal, that you don't have to make the ask. That person comes to you and says, that's amazing, how can I get on board with that? Because they are so inspired and you're connecting with the right people at the right time. And to me, that's like you've hit like expert level fundraiser, because you don't have to do that part that makes us all get the heartburn about, you know, now can I ask you for your gift? Because when they say, how can I get involved? Then you say, here's 3 things we need money for. This is how much we need for each thing. And then you let them decide where they come in, and you should kind of, know where they're going to come in. But right, so you know what you're presenting them. But they ultimately are meeting that philanthropic need that they have, solving that problem, and you've helped them do that. And so when it feels almost too good to be true from that perspective, but you experienced it. You're sharing the passion, you're sharing the work, and it's just kind of waiting to see who's going to join me with this.
Absolutely. Maybe I'm going to be diverting on the point a little bit, and I know I don't know, Teresa. I don't know you where you work or where you're living. I'm from Chile, and only recently we started working I've started working with a U.S. audience in a way, and it's amazing. It's amazing all this culture of philanthropy and giving that you have in the U.S. It's quite different in other places, and these spaces that we're talking about, they might look at it a little different. I couldn't give you many examples because I haven't done it much myself here in Chile, but I do know that there are lots of differences. So reading these books, hearing from what you tell us, I find it extremely useful. I just wanted to say basically that you have a great culture of giving in the US, and I feel that this that you were saying at at different levels, and we are solving someone else's problem. That is a pretty amazing thing. I mean, not everybody would see that as a problem in a different country. So that's just like an asset or a strength of the North American culture. So I think that's a positive thing too.
Well, Teresa, I'm so glad to see you. Teresa is actually, this is kind of crazy. Teresa and I live in the same community. I had the opportunity to meet her last Friday. And so I've got Teresa on the call, who's probably a few miles away from me. And then Alan, who you are thousands of miles away. So that's awesome. That's what I love about this so much.
Well, it's nice to see you and meet you, Alan, even though I'm not meeting you in person. But yeah, I'm new to nonprofit. I just started a nonprofit at the end of last year, so I have not finished reading the book either. But I've already learned some stuff just from listening to Melanie speak. So I pulled out. I was busy and moving around and doing too much. That's why I was off camera at first, and so now I'm sitting still and trying to like catch up on these mental notes that I made just from the little nuggets I've already gotten just from hearing Melanie.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really liked this book. To kind of sum it up, it read very differently than I thought it was going to, a little bit more instruction manually than other ones we've done. But I think, as shown at the beginning, I think the resource section in the back is worth whatever the cost of the book was. Because the book itself is only about 100 pages, but the last, like, probably, you could probably see it, maybe the last 10th of the whole book, maybe a little bit more than that, is all resources.
Yeah, I'm one of those people, like, I want to get a sneak peek of what happens at the end of the book. And so I did take a sneak peek at that. I was like, oh, wow. And then I went back to the beginning.
Yeah. And for me, it was that I didn't read this until the last few days. And I was like, how many pages do I have to read before our meeting on Thursday? And I was like, oh, okay. The big chunk of this in the back is not actually book, but the call sheets and the contact reports and things like that. Like, I could see if you're doing, fundraising beyond grant writing, because that's what I'm exclusively doing now. But in my roles before was doing all the different fundraising aspect. These resources in the back would be hugely helpful. And even for some of it for grant writing, for talking to grant administrators and stuff, the meeting notes and things like that. And just, referring to some of those scripts and maybe doing some role playing with people to, Alan, get comfortable with that pivot, to learn different ways that you feel comfortable saying it. And then I always like to hear from people based on how far you've gotten so far. Like, do you think this is a book that you would recommend to people? If Amazon was asking you to write a review?
I would. Yeah, I would. I would finish it first, but
Yeah.
but so far I would definitely would.
I got first, but so far, yeah, it definitely gets you thinking. For somebody like me, I've never asked anybody for any money, not even for myself. So that's learning just that first chapter when it was talk about pivoting that conversation. And not only that, but even just being open and honest about what you're wanting to have that conversation about, instead of just throwing them completely off guard, only to hear them say, well, I'll never give you money, So that's, those were little key nuggets I got just out of that first chapter.
Yeah. And it's a great, I sound like I'm just promoting stuff here all day long, but it worked out so kind of crazy well to be a follow-up to what we read last month, which was the Mr. Rogers Effect. My background always wants to block that out. Oh, look, Mr. Rogers just floating there all by himself. But it really, because in this one, the author talks about that authentic listening, and that works so well with what they say in this one about how you have to stop and be quiet. And I don't know, I know you both know me a little bit, but I'm very rarely quiet. Like, I talk a lot. And so for that, it's always, when I feel awkward in a conversation, I want to fill the air with sound. And so it's hard for me to say, would you consider a gift of $25,000 to our capital campaign? And then, zip it. And they talk about how important that is. But then I think the Mr. Rogers Effect talks about how to listen to those responses in a way that builds that relationship and isn't just you preparing to respond to their response. So I kept going back to that book in my head. So if you have a chance to read this one is not about fundraising at all.
Right.
It's just about relationship building and how to basically just be a better human. Like, it was really, when I finished reading, I was like, it would apply to really any profession and any role that somebody, like, even things in here, I thought of my role as a wife and mother, like things that I could do to be a better listener for my kids. And, instead of rushing through and being like, yes, get on with this, like, as kids do. But I thought it was a really great follow-up for that. And do you think, based on what you've read so far, that there are things in this book that you will, in our current book, that you'll be able to utilize on a daily, or not maybe not a daily basis, but just in your role?
Yes, for sure.
Good.
Definitely. I've got a trip coming up in 2 weeks, and I'm looking forward to putting these things into practice.
Good.
We'll see.
Well, I appreciate both of your time so much. I'm so grateful that you jumped on the call this morning. And if you are interested, if you read the Mr. Rogers Effect or any of our previous books, I always upload these, even if I think there's been one where it was just me like talking to the screen. But I always upload the videos of these to our YouTube channel. So if you read any of them, any of the past books, and you kind of want to go through what other people may have shared about the books or highlighted, those are available on there. And then we've got our next book club meeting. We've got the Zoom link for that one, and I can send that to you. And it should be on our website as well. But it's Tuesday, March 26th at 10:30 Eastern. And we're going to be reading the Nonprofiteers Fundraising Field Guide, which sounds kind of similar to what we've done. But this one is written in a bit more of a narrative format and less script-like. But it's 30 practical ways to boost philanthropy through servant leadership. So sounds maybe similar to what you said you were reading too, Alan. Yeah. So I hope that you both can join me for that one. And awesome. And good luck on your trip, Alan. I'm excited to hear about how that goes for you. And Teresa, I'm excited to further connect with you and keep in conversation with you.
For sure. Thanks so much for doing this, Melanie.
Of course.
Pleasure to meet you, Teresa. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day. See you next time.
You
Bye.
too.
Bye-bye.